Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of Show Me SaaS. Here today, we got a little smaller crew. The spring break has hit us here, and so you've got Toby here. Toby, you want to say hi real quick?
Hi.
Toby's our usual here, and brings his SaaS perspective to this. But today, we're really looking at a topic that, on the outside, probably doesn't look like this huge significant SaaS topic that everybody's talking about: isolation and data partitioning and deployment models, which certainly are things we've talked about as part of this discussion. But what we found is, as we've started building reference architectures and we've started really getting into the weeds of solutions with customers, that this topic of routing keeps coming up. And routing seems like, yeah, of course I've got to route traffic and we have to build networking constructs inside of our architecture. And depending on the stack we have, those might look different. But what we find is the myriad of different ways that you build SaaS solutions, the myriad of different deployment models, the different technologies you use, all bring their sort of own nuances to the routing sort of story. And suddenly you have to be thinking about, because tenants in a certain context or a tenants in a certain tier, and because I have this particular deployment model, I've had to somehow figure out, how do I get somebody from in the front door of my application and get their traffic routed to the appropriate way, and hopefully routed in a way that is nimble and sort of supports the scale of your solution. So today, we've, in our last episodes, we've gone a little more into the code and tried to show code, a ton of code. Today, this is a broader topic. This is more how do we get people to sort of think about the full spectrum of the different sort of routing sort of considerations that are out there and routing possibilities that you need to be thinking about. And we'll wander across different stacks and really highlight to you where all the different points across a few of these solutions that routing ends up being a big part of the discussion. And we'll look at EKS, so we'll look at serverless, we'll look at some of the different models and discuss that. But that's our focus for today. Toby, I know you've been in this routing space a little bit in some of your work around the EKS space. And I know when we worked on that together, there was a lot of discussion, a lot more than I think we thought there would be.
Well, it's
around
tough,
routing.
right? It's really it's tough to figure out some of the, there's so many technologies available to you, especially in the EKS space, right? The ecosystem is huge. So you've got all the app mesh or service meshes and ingress controllers and all those different mechanisms you could employ. But trying to pick a good story for a blog or for our case, the reference architecture, it was tough.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's, even when you finally get down to, I think I know what I want to do with my routing technology solution, the range of technologies, depending on which stack you're in, there's a lot to choose from, and which one's the right one, and which one's the right one for me, and how does that affect cost, and how does that affect scale, and all those other things. Those all get into the equation. Yeah. And obviously we're looking for ways that where introducing a new tenant doesn't suddenly mean we have to go run all kinds of code to somehow make routing work. So we're looking for ways to make that kind of frictionless as possible as well.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the places where I at least feel like I don't have all of this figured out yet, right? I'll have customer engagements where they've got some really unique scenario and it throws a curveball, and it takes me a while to even come up to speed on what they're doing, right? So there's a ton of, this space is kind of moving, given all of the, at least on the container side, all of the technology that's advancing there. And it kind of is part and parcel with security too, right? So that flavors it as well.
Yeah. So, so maybe just to sort of set the stage a little bit, let's just look at some of the big picture kind of things that might influence your routing scheme in your application, right? The easiest one to start with is obviously silo versus pool, right? If you have silo or a pooled environment, that can certainly affect your routing scheme, because now
let's break that down though.
Okay.
Siloed meaning that my client application is hitting dedicated infrastructure on a back end. Is that what we mean by that?
Yeah. So, or dedicated, or some part of it is dedicated, right? So it may not be that the entire thing is dedicated, but there's, again, full stack silo has certainly got a routing set of considerations, and and then the sort of hybrid sort of models that we talk about, where some siloed, some pool, all those things have impact.
Sure. Okay. Sorry to interrupt you. Keep going.
No, and I guess for me, if you there's that view of it, the sort of am I silo, am I pool, but then there's like how does the tenant identify themselves when they come in the front door?
Right. Because that was a challenge that we had, right? Like you've got one API server. Let's say it's just api.example.com. And if all your tenants are hitting it, what mechanism are you using to kind of differentiate? And if they are in a case of silo, if they're hitting one URL, what happens to send them off to a different stack of compute, right? That's running at that same URL. There's some traffic cop there.
Yeah, including that, and this routing isn't restricted to the back end, right? Then the classic sort of thing is, how do I get the request to some microservice running on the back end? Routing is not constrained to that view. It's also, and we'll see this, we'll get there. Routing can be, how do I get to the right user pool for my tenant, or like how do I get that incoming URL mapped to the right consumer as well on that side. Now it's a little bit different of routing in that it's more like mapping, probably more than routing, but it still gets mixed into that routing discussion, because how you identify a tenant ends up how you end up resolving to all these different
right. Like how do you authenticate the right folks when they're trying to hit that URL different from the other URLs, for instance?
Exactly. And then if you go, I guess for me, if you just think, and we'll get there in a little more detail here, but if you think about stacks, EKS, ECS, serverless, account per tenant, like all of these things may have different sort of natural front ends to them, if you will, entry points to them that may use different technologies and different strategies for how to route for them. Yeah. So, and so for me, I think no matter what we do, and this is the challenge of today's particular show, which is why we're not like digging into a ton of code today. The challenge is really more, how do I look across those spectrum of possibilities and figure out like which combination of these things are right for me? So today, probably we're more about like give you a healthy respect for the landscape, but you're probably going to have to go figure out which one of these is the right one for your environment.
Totally.
But if we want to, let's just start. Let me pull something up here. Let's just talk at the front door of your environment, right? Let's start from the outside in a little bit and say, hey, I've got tenants that are going to come into my environment. And like we said, these tenants have to identify themselves. There's a couple ways to do this, right? Like you guys, Toby, you had, like on the left, you'll see I have this notion of a domain-driven design. And like maybe you could talk through some of what the possibilities are when you're using a domain here and some of the things you need to think about.
Well, so for us, EKS, we were using Nginx and had the ability to spin up a new route based on a tenant onboarding event. So new tenant 2 would show up and we just go tell Route 53 and we tell Nginx that, hey, there's a new backend, actually a new route pointed to some set of infrastructure that, a new container that we brought up. And here's what it is. And then the client had to do something, but the challenge was so the backend got stood up. We had now tenant1.abc.com, tenant2.abc.com. The challenge was that there's only one client because we had a CloudFront bucket that was serving all of that, right? So how do we resolve that? So we had to do some interesting code in the client side to do that resolution. But from a bringing up the backend perspective, that was fairly straightforward with just the
right. But for me here, right, this and we see this a lot with SaaS providers. We'll see either a subdomain as a concept here, right, where they'll say, hey, each tenant has some friendly name that is a subdomain that identifies them, or they may even have like a vanity domain that is their like a full domain that belongs to them. And to me, when you come in with that, right, that isn't necessarily your tenant identifier. In fact, it's intentionally not usually your tenant identifier. It's some.
No, but it does have a mapping to a tenant, right? Like that was the thing that was the one piece that we used to map that tenant, right? So we knew that tenants, regardless of their tenant identifier, some big long GUID, would be running at some origin or some domain, and we could make the choices based on that.
Right, right. And for me, that's where I think when when I first started looking at this problem, I was thinking of it more like this is just a DNS problem, and I'll get your incoming tenant. I'll do some kind of configuration of some routing rules, and I'll automatically just get you to the stack you need to go to. When in reality, it isn't as simple as just sort of just a one time sort of DNS sort of mapping to some endpoint.
No.
Now
Yeah.
that
Keep
so
going.
go ahead. So on the
No.
right hand side of this is sorry about that, Toby. Is kind of the inverse of this. Like sometimes we'll call this like a shared domain kind of model, or we'll say it's a data driven. I don't think we have a great name for this side of it really, but the notion here is that I'm not going to identify myself at all to you in terms of my URL. I'm going to hit some shared URL that everybody hits, and I'm just going to authenticate, and I'm going to use the sort of remnants of authentication. In this case, which we usually talk about is some kind of JOT token, although it could be something else depending on what you're doing. And that context now just has to flow through the experience and has to shape my routing instead. I guess for me, like if you look at one versus the other, do you think one has advantages over the other one here, Toby?
I mean, I feel like there might be some upper limit that you'd hit going, the subdomain based route, if you were considering all of the moving parts that have to kind of be invoked whenever you onboard. You got to do a Route 53 alias, and you got to do all of this other stuff. I don't know what that limit is. It's probably fairly high. But but on the other hand, it does support, I feel like it supports the silo kind of use case a little more naturally. It feels a little more natural to that, a given tenant with a subdomain will have what feels like its own stack is kind of all parceled off on that subdomain. But yeah, I don't know that I have a preference, or one would be any better than the other. I guess it just depends on the requirements of your application.
Yeah, I guess for me, I don't think one's better than the other one. I think it often probably comes down to what kind of experience you're trying to create as well. Like some people, like the domain is part of their story. Like you get your own subdomain or you get your own domain, and it becomes a compelling part of the experience. And so
I feel like there's two distinct things that we're talking about here, though, right? There's one that is, you've got a client application, and that is very much customer facing and very much in the face that, hey, when I sign up for Slack or I sign up for whoever, I've got in the case of a domain base, I've got some domain that represents me as a customer, as a tenant in this system. But then you've got the back end that thing hits, and that should be largely transparent, right? As a customer, I shouldn't care how that client is hitting its backend or resolving its backend. It should just work as far as
yeah, I'm thinking more as through the mind of the SaaS architect or builder here, right? Like how much work do I have to do, and how well does it scale, and how hard does it make my onboarding? How much friction is in this experience, or how much do the tools sort of naturally align themselves to one of these or the other?
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like on the JOT side of this, you definitely have all this sort of, I've got to unpack the JOT. I've got to figure out, like, I'm going to cache the JOT. I've got the life cycle of the JOT and all those other things that get sort of wrapped up in my routing story here. I don't think that makes it a bad solution. And there's plenty of good things you can do over there. And we'll talk about some of those, but I guess it's my own sort of opinion that there might be a few more moving parts to think about, versus the domain-based approach here. But really, you're going to pick the business is probably going to tell you which one of these two models you're going to use, more than you picking it. But I think these are the ones I mostly see. Have you seen any other variation of this? I haven't.
Well, there's the service meshes were invented partly for this reason, right? Like being able to kind of abstract out all of these kind of baggage that you'd have to include in each of your microservices into some kind of control plane, such that it can be managed outside of the services themselves. So I think I would say that control plane aspects of any kind of service mesh, Istio or otherwise, might be a flavor, but it's probably on the data-driven routing side of the flavor.
Right. And if you're so, maybe that's a sort of a check in the pros column for a container-based solution, only in that the mesh in a container-based environment gives you something around all of this that lets you have some creative ways to deal with resolution and routing and some of those other bits, right? That are a little bit different. And I did want to sort of highlight, we talked about the fact that this could also be related to resolving identity. We've talked a lot about identity. I don't want to go into this a lot of detail, but certainly some would argue this is just not part of the routing story. The routing is all about getting the REST request to the back end. But somewhere mixed in all of this is still you're picking an inbound mechanism, and that inbound mechanism is going to have to potentially resolve to things even like user pools or other sort of tenant mapped constructs that aren't just back-end requests. So to me, I include this really just to say, put this in your mental math,
for sure,
I think, of things you should be thinking about when you pick a strategy.
We have a question that popped up, Todd, kind of related to the first two slides, actually. So I'll go ahead and pop this one up on the screen.
Sure. If we have
I think, go ahead and read it. But I think the thrust of this question was if we've effectively partitioned the tenants into their own infrastructure, is that, do we still need JOTs to kind of control routing to that?
Right. So for me, it's a good question, which is, and we're going to get into like account per tenant and VPC. So if you look at those kind of models where I say have essentially got a full stack silo of resources for a tenant, and somebody still says they're going to, somebody comes in the front door. Now the question, and Toby and I were talking about this, I think yesterday or something, where does your application live and where is it running? Where does it reside? Because if the application is running itself in the full stack silo, then you're really just trying to get somebody into the silo of, and they're really routing to that application hosted inside that full stack. But in a lot of cases, the app is running outside of the stack, the back end sort of stack. And in that model, whether it's JOT or it's domain or something still has to tell you, I have some piece of tenant context, and that piece of tenant context needs to tell me, am I going to VPC1 or am I going to go to VPC2?
Does that
and JOT could be the way to do that. Maybe your only way to do that if you're using a shared domain somewhere in there. Something has to tell you which tenant's going to get routed.
Does that make sense? I'll have Hafiz. Was it, I think his name Hafiz? It's like, for instance, in the reference architecture, we had one CloudFront distribution, right? So that was the only place that the client was running, and so every single tenant would just have an alias to that app, to that bundle of JavaScript and HTML. So the challenge was, while we did have segregated backends for them, they could technically hit everything. We wanted to make sure that if they for some reason hit a tenant that they weren't supposed to, that JOT token wasn't kind of insurance policy that they weren't going to see any data that they weren't supposed to.
Right. If you say I have like a siloed piece of infrastructure on the back or siloed stack of some kind, right? No matter how you get in the front door, something still there has to be some rule, some mechanism there. And there are many mechanisms here. It does not have to be JOT that would be map me to that URL entry point of that stack.
Yep.
And we just list JOT because JOT gets used a lot in this context and especially I don't know what else identifies you. We could back up from JOT and say your identity, whatever it is of your authentication experience, yields something that gives you tenant context, and that tenant context is then mapped to some route as well. So hopefully that answers the question. And super vague because there's so many it depends parts of this answer, unfortunately. But even here, like I talked about the fact that, if you come in and I've got this sort of big blob of something called routing infrastructure as a placeholder for, depends on what kind of sort of environment you're in and what kind of mechanism you're using here. And I say, hey, I've got full stack silos here, right? So I've got two tenants that are running in full stack silo. And by the way, super common, I've got a pooled environment as well running alongside of it. And then incoming is some kind of tenant context, a URL, a JOT, some kind of tier could be driving this experience as well. What mechanism is in that routing infrastructure to take that incoming context and connect it? Some things happen right in like the API gateway, for example, or right in an ALB will resolve that routing, and it might already be resolved by the time you get in here. It sort of depends on which stack you're running and which technologies you're running. So for me, this is the sort of, I think everybody focuses on what's in these purple boxes, and am I going to be silo? Am I going to be pooled? And what does my silo look like? And what's the how will I make sure that tenant one can't access the resources of tenant two across that silo? All things we classically talk about. To me, though, how these get routed and how all that gets onboarded. So by the way, we aren't going to dig into onboarding because we've talked about that before, but you can imagine when somebody signs up, something has to configure these somewhere, create some kind of entry somewhere that maps this on the fly to the new tenant that gets introduced.
Yeah.
The other go ahead, Toby.
Let's say we got another question popped up, not necessarily based on this topic, but I think it's an interesting.
I prefer questions, so if you have them, ask them.
I got them. Kelstek is asking about the auditability of it based on compliance.
So in other words, if I'm going through this process and I'm getting requests, and is there something I can do to sort of inspect the activity that's going on across this boundary to be able to be sure that somebody is meeting a compliance regulation? And I don't know that it's more about, this is more of a routing question. I feel like this probably fits more into our tenant isolation kind of discussions. To me, or I'm misunderstanding the question. To me, it's hey, I need to ensure that whatever's happening with tenant one is not crossing a boundary to tenant two, and with the right appropriate granularity, right, all the way down to, if I'm HIPAA, whatever sort of rules HIPAA would apply there, I'm going to apply those scopes and accesses to this. But I don't think that's the job of the routing infrastructure to do that. I believe that's the job of the isolation sort of mechanisms.
I would agree with that. I've been on the SOC 2, so actually it's PCI and SOC 2 side of this. And on the SOC 2 side, it was a little easier because that whatever that is, certification is, they have some framework for, how are you protecting the confidentiality and availability and all of those kind of things. And they ask you to effectively prove out your story here. Like,
sure,
how are you controlling this? And then they just go and they test you against what you've said you've done, right? So it's like, hey, we do it this way, and then they go and test it. So in that particular case, in SOC 2, I think that you could come up with a story that proves this out based on, but like you said, it's probably more on the isolation vein than on the routing vein. I don't know that they share the same kind of transport mechanism potentially, but at the end of the day, the illustration of compliance would be more about the isolation of it.
Yeah, and I think this is where SaaS blurs the lines a little bit here, if you think about it, because we have these compliance bodies, GDPR and HIPAA and everybody else that say this data has to be protected. But even if I had no compliance standards at all for my application, as a SaaS application, I fundamentally have to ensure that tenants are isolated no matter what, even without any needing to meet the needs of any compliance body. And I have to prove that to my customers to be sure that their environments are appropriately segregated. Now, if you say within a given tenant, now you're into another level of sort of, is this RBAC, or is it like, what are you doing at that level to ensure you're meeting compliance standards? And then the question is, the prove that out part of that is always the hard bit. Like, what are you doing in terms of tracking activity, and how do you prove the case that something didn't happen is always an interesting question. Here. So I don't know that we fully answered that, but that's my general thought. I did want to get back to just another nuance of this that might be obvious to everybody. But this routing isn't just about full stack. So in this model where I showed full stack and a pool running here, it gets even more elaborate sometimes, which is, I can have individual microservices that are deployed in variations of silo and pool and per tenant kind of models. So now my routing doesn't just need to know, hey, you're tenant one and everything for tenant one goes here. have to say, oh, you're tenant one and you're making a request to the order service. Oh, you have a siloed order service, so I need to route to that specific one. Or tenant 3, you're a pooled tenant, I'm gonna route you to this shared microservice. And I feel like that is a nuance that I don't think we usually ever even get into. If you look at our serverless SaaS reference architecture, we do some of this, but this is where you actually have to sometimes keep mapping tables to know, hey, this tenant's in this particular tier, and because they're in this tier, they get their own version of these services, and because they have these own services, I need to know the entry points of those services so that I can route them successfully. You guys didn't do this in EKS, right, Toby? This was not.
Well, we did in the workshop. We did. So we have a notion in the workshop of a siloed provisioning of those services, and it's effectively the same container that just gets spun up, but for exclusive use by a siloed tenant in its own namespace with its own limit ranges and resource quotas and that kind of stuff. But in the reference architecture, everything was siloed. We just assumed that everybody was in their own and provisioned it when we onboarded them.
Cool. All right. So that's kind of like backdrop. And these are like the front door of the app. We kind of talked about how to get in the front door of the app. And then, by the way, thinking about the different kinds of backends you might need to route to, or the different other resources you might need to map to, like user pools, is the example we gave here. But now let's like dig into a specific sort of environment and say, we're doing full stack silo. I'm going to give each tenant their own VPC, and I'll run them completely on their own VPC. Let's assume that the application is still running out. I'm running some single page application running out on CloudFront. And I've got these 2 tenants come in. Well, what do we do here, right? Like, obviously, I assume that there's some sort of networking construct, maybe an ALB, or something sitting in front of these VPCs that have a URL that's the entry point. What do we do in a VPC per tenant model? Yeah, I know, Toby, you and I
we chatted a little bit about this.
Yeah. So I'm curious, like, when you think about this, and I know you said at the top, like, I'm not sure I know all the answers to all of these things. What are you thinking here?
I mean, I would probably start. I guess the key point before I even answer is that scale matters here, right? Are we talking about 50 tenants, or are we talking about 1 million tenants, right? Because it would influence the solution I would prescribe here. If it were a handful and it fit within the realm of the limits of an ALB, target groups, or something like that, then this would probably just be level 7 routing based on host header or something like that, and get to the right VPC based on a target group. If it blew those limits out of the water, then we'd have to figure something else out, right? And I don't know what that is. Like, I would have to kind of do some digging.
Yeah. And I think, obviously one of the ways we had talked about in the past was a potential solution to this, because I confess to feeling like I think I know things I could kind of be a good answer to this problem, but I don't have that like one big hammer that I'm like, always do this for the VPC per tenant model, because I feel like either I haven't stayed close enough to the evolution of some of the new network sort of constructs that are available here, or there's just not a great sort of answer here right now. But you're right, the scale piece of this is a huge piece of this. So if we look at this particular example, is back to what you were getting at, is some people, you could put an API gateway in front of the VPACs. You could have the tenant context come in, and then you could extract from the tenant context with a Lambda authorizer the JOT and find out which tenant it is, and then inject a header. That would be, and that's kind of where you were going a little bit there, Toby, right? And now I can go write routing rules at the ALB level that would say, oh, based on tenant header X, I will route to stack Y, right?
But even so we've got a couple limits here. Obviously, the limits of the load balancer based on a number of routing rules, which is pretty low. But also, assuming that wasn't even an issue, assuming that just went into some like endlessly scalable, ingress or something like that, you could potentially hit limits with API gateway, right? Like, you could only get, I think, not so many not such that you can only make so many calls, but it's more about like calls per second, right? Like there's a certain threshold that if you've got a significant enough population of users that are all hitting your APIs at once, like you'll start getting throttled at some point. So, there again, this would potentially change based on volume.
Yeah, and that's so it's weird is when I first saw this and somebody had pointed this out to me and I was like, eureka, I found it. And I actually think if you stay in that VPC per tenant mindset and say, well, a lot of people who are doing VPC per tenant, or at least their premium tier tenants are running in a VPC per tenant, maybe they're running the rest of their tenants in some pooled model, then the number of tenants that you'd want to run in a VPC per tenant model, just more from a practicality perspective and an operations and an agility perspective, you wouldn't want that number to get crazy high. So there's some tension here between, okay, this mechanism works, but it works up to a limit. But should you be hitting that limit anyway? Because are you really starting to exceed what's practical for a number of VPCs? And the reality is some people have tons of VPCs in it. And so, in that scenario, they might exceed the limits here. But generally, I still think this is a reasonable solution. You just have to have this sort of caveat added to the whole thing, which is like explore the limits closely before you go down this path.
Yeah.
And I guess this is one area I probably would like to go back to some network specialists at AWS. Maybe we'll have one on the show or something.
That'd be cool.
Who could really kind of like, what are the trade-offs here? I think this scenario, you and I both know that we think we could afford to go a little deeper here.
Yeah. I had a customer call once where we had a specialist for ALB on, and the load that they were talking about was significantly more than, API gateway was significantly more than what at peak was significantly more than what API gateway. And these are hard limits too. They weren't like just soft limits that you could expand based on the account. And the suggestion was to use, Kelstack here talks about offloading ingress. That was the suggestion, was to offload the ingress into ECS and to handle it that way.
Yeah.
So it kind of rolled their own.
That's cool. Now another variation of this one is the fact that you obviously have this tier-based approach to this as well, right? So most of what we've talked about so far sort of implies that we get the tenant context, we know which tenant you are, and we're routing you. But there can be tier-driven models here as well, or a combination of tier and your tenant context might send you somewhere, right? So could be, you're in the platinum tier, and then I need your tenant context to know which VPC to send you to. But you're in the basic tier. I know if you're in basic tier, I don't need to know anything else because you're going to go to the pooled environment and everything just goes there, right? So there's nothing exotic about this, as much as I wanted to make it clear that this isn't always just get me from tenant ID to get me to the right stack. It's usually, there can be other data in that payload that you need to look at.
Totally.
Now, the other one here that we see a lot is this notion of account per tenant. And certainly it has lots of the same sort of caveats attached to it that we had attached to VPC per tenant, right? Scale is still an open question here. How many accounts are you really going to run? And but I think the mechanisms here are more now, are you doing something cross account? Are you going to have to open up sort of paths and what do you do to enable somebody to get in to the account? We actually see this from the control plane side as well, by the way. There's the tenants route in, and when we do account per tenant, we have the same issues with how does the control plane of your environment access each one of these tenant amounts. So there's two sort of routing sort of considerations here. Mm-hmm. And for me, at least, I don't know what, Toby, if you have perspectives on this, this is usually more just about how open am I going to make this, and to what extent can one account do it? Or am I going to run the app inside the account with the back end side by side?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, I don't know that I have a whole lot to say there. We're definitely seeing this more and more, and they're starting to become more tools within AWS to kind of manage this with like organizations and control power and that kind of stuff. So we're starting to see this more and more. And in fact, I think just the latest SDK I had a customer that was really keen to know how to delete some of the accounts if they were offloading tenants. Our latest SDK, I think, has a new API in it to deregister an account. So definitely we're making moves in this direction to support this. I think if you look across cloud providers, this is kind of an AWS has, being that we were first, we started with this whole notion of account. Why would anybody ever need anything bigger than an account? So other cloud providers don't necessarily have these limits. We don't necessarily have them either, but we still call it an account, which seems to kind of put it in a box. But yeah, there's no reason that you couldn't manage all of that with the appropriate
Cool.
controls in place.
All right. So for me, I feel like we sort of tick those, obviously the siloed sort of infrastructures have these nuances. I think we owe another show to that. But let's dig into one where we have built stuff out. Let's look at let's dig into what it would mean to do routing inside of EKS, and certainly have a slide on this. But I'm curious, when we settled on a particular approach here, and I'm curious in your mind, like, what were the things that were on the table? Because I think I said at the beginning, like, we had a fair amount of discussion around this. What were the different sort of things we were thinking about when we did the EKS routing model? And you might explain what we were routing to, because that had some influence on the just choices we made, right?
Well, I think so is the question, what were the considerations? What was on the table that influenced how we came up with using Nginx versus?
Yeah, so we ended up with Nginx. What were the alternatives to Nginx that we could have?
Well, at the time we were thinking of ALB. I think there was an ALB ingress controller that the community or AWS had produced that was an option. But at the time, if we spun it up, it didn't handle, there was some aspect of it, and I'm forgetting the details, but it would spin up an ALB per tenant. And obviously that's expensive, right? We didn't want to go that route. And there were some other, I think, ingress controllers we were playing with. We talked a little bit about using early on. We talked a little bit, I don't know if you're in these discussions or not, Todd, but we talked a little bit about using Istio Ingress Gateway. Ranjith, who was the guy, my colleague that co-authored that with me, had some experience there. And I can't remember why I think they were in the middle of upgrading versions 2. And so we just decided to go with a proxy ingress controller, which was Nginx.
Right. So we ended up with, something. This is a highly simplified version of what we did. But I guess the other piece of this is we had a namespace per tenant model in this environment, right? So part of the requirement was that we were coming in with a subdomain, and then we had to somehow map from the subdomain to the specific service inside of the namespace, so that the request didn't just get to some one common entry point, it got to that namespace for that service, right?
Yeah. So if you and this is where I wouldn't call it secret sauce, because it was honestly a little bit, it felt a little hacky, but this is where this is the challenge, right? We have all of that. There's one Route 53, one CloudFront distribution, one client, and the client was the only piece that knew how to get to its backend. Nothing else did, right? So that we didn't do this data-driven thing that you had like the first or second slide. It was all statically mapped to a route on the backend. So in our case, the namespaces were all running at the same host address, so api.example.com, with different routes that would bring you into to the appropriate siloed services for those clients. So if you take that an example, tenant1.abc.com, he knew by convention that he was going to be running at api.abc.com/tenant1/ all the services. So the client was the piece that actually took its own header, its own origin, and said, okay, I'm going to take my name and tack it onto the end so that I could route accordingly. And so that's how routing happened.
Yeah, and that always felt a little clunky to me, but I didn't, the fact that the client would play any role in that sort of was something that was less than ideal to me.
Yeah.
But I will say that we talked to an awful lot of EKS people about what our options were, and there were tons of tools in the space, by the way. But this is kind of where we landed. Now, I again, we'll get to there's some alternatives here since this went out that are looking at alternate ways to do this. But But for me, like I think this emphasizes that like this has a pretty big bearing on how onboarding and how tenants get introduced and how like this isn't just like, oh, we once we put the ingressing controller in, we made our choice, we're done, and it's just going to route traffic. Like it influences the code of your solution, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and if you look, in fact, I think I included here just like I took one of the services here and just tried to give you a sense of like some of the configuration that's here so that you see the routing that gets configured as part of this.
Yeah.
And this has to exist somewhere. So in fact, I think in the example we have a YAML file, this YAML file per microservice.
Yep.
And that microservice has to then tell it like, hey, when I set up this new namespace for this new tenant, I got to go configure the route.
Yeah. So over on the right there, that path, that red one, the tenant one order, we had a template, a YAML file that just had a placeholder in it, and when we onboarded it, kicked off a code pipeline that would stream edit some of those template or those placeholders out, and then just do a kube control apply on this manifest and bring up those services in the appropriate namespaces.
Yeah. So just for me, I'm just trying to hyper emphasize, I think, the fact that like these, to me, these routing choices just reach all across your architecture in ways you don't expect. Now, the timing for today was kind of ironic because we've been a gentleman named Farouk on that's part of AWS has been working on a blog post around an alternate approach to doing routing inside of the EKS solution that Toby's referencing here, to get around some of these specific sort of challenges that we talked about, and to push the responsibility more out to natural EKS constructs to solve this problem. And that blog post just went live today. We'll try to drop you a link.
I just dropped a link just now.
Drop the link to that blog post in here. But I don't know, Toby, do you want to kind of walk through the basic idea of what he's done here, or do you?
I mean, I can give it I can take a crack at it. I to be honest, I haven't set this up in my own account yet, so I don't know all the moving pieces. But as I understand it, all of these services are virtual services just managed by the Ingress Gateway. So the Ingress Gateway is kind of Istio's answer to Nginx Ingress Controller. But effectively, a client request comes in, it passes through that network load balancer. The Istio gateway will see, is there a authorization cookie on it? If not, it kind of sends it to an OIDC proxy based on, this is the part that gets murky for me, based on somehow, I'm assuming it has to be the tenant's origin or somehow some header, some kind of piece of information that request has that identifies tenant A with that tenant A identity provider. So it sends it to the appropriate identity provider. Again, magic happens there. I have no idea exactly the moving pieces there, but it routes it correctly to the right proxy. Of course, then it comes back now that it's got redirected. Now that it's got the token or the cookie, it hits the gateway. The gateway says, "Oh, I see, we're good," and then passes it through to the appropriate namespace. So a slight variation, not a slight, probably a major variation on what we had in the reference architecture, but from I don't know if you call it scalability, but it gets rid of that thing that felt a little janky with the client rewriting its own API backend, right? So now the client is blissfully ignorant of all that. It just makes requests, and that request is handled offloaded into this Istio ingress.
Yeah, I definitely think that this is kind of taking and saying, hey, I'm in an EKS environment. I have these mesh kind of tools available to me. And they're good at sort of resolving and routing these things the way they ought to be routed. And so here they get applied to resolving which user pool you need to route against and to be able to get you authenticated so that the code in the actual backend services don't have to figure out what that mapping is. And then it can also then resolve that to the namespace that you have to go to. Now, you still have bits that have to happen for these things to get configured as new tenants, get onboarded, and so on. Mm-hmm. But it feels like a better distribution of the problem to me.
Totally. Well, that's really the whole goal of the service mesh in the first place, right? Is you got all of that. I'd hate to use the word undifferentiated because it's so overused at AWS, but you've got all of this boilerplate stuff, right? These, like, if you like back, remember AOP? Is that still a thing? Aspect oriented programming, where
Yep.
so you had like your logging, and you had your identity, and you had all these things that you could decorate your methods with all of this stuff. Well, they've kind of taken that same approach with service meshes, right? Like you have logging, and you've got tracing, and you've got identity, and you've got service discovery, and all of these stuff that kind of shown up as a result of this microservices architecture that we didn't necessarily have back in the monolithic days. And how do you take all of that stuff and kind of offload it into something else, so that not your service developers can focus on writing the services, just the business logic for the service, and not all that boilerplate stuff that every service has to have. So that was really as I understand it, that was really kind of the advent and the itch that the service mesh has scratched.
Yeah, so I encourage you to go check out the blog post around this, and I think you might see the reference architecture itself just absorb this into the reference architecture at some point. And
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Banner way to do it. I still think, like we always say, they are a reference architecture, not the reference architecture. So, like everything else, in 6 months there might be a better way or some alternate way somebody knows about that we haven't thought of. So, I think it's going to be in constant evolution, but I still think this is a good one to have kind of on the radar. Now, I also wanted to highlight, just as another data point in all this, is something that the sort of serverless SaaS reference architecture had to do, and it has the same sort of problems. Obviously, it's an API gateway sort of centric kind of model here, because API gateway and Lambda just sort of go well together here. They feel like a natural pair. But in this environment, in the serverless SaaS environment, we had different tiered tenants, platinum tier tenants, and other tenants. And you can see in the bottom left corner that we essentially have, hey, there's an API gateway in front of different backends, and there's an API gate for different for tier tenant 1 and for tenant 2, and then there's this pooled environment that's here. And in this environment, we had to figure out, as you came in, I don't think we had a separate subdomain or domain here. You just came in, and based on your JOT token, we had to essentially say, hey, not only, you're a platinum tier tenant, but then which user pool you're at, because we let platinum tier tenants have their own user pools. Or were you going to go against the pooled user pool that's out there? If I can say the word pool 3 more times, that would be awesome. But also, more importantly, how will I know which gateway to send you to as a tenant out of this? And you'll see highlighted down there under tenant management, we actually stuffed an API gateway URL into the configuration here, which again, this is kind of back to what you were talking about, Toby. It's one of those things where, well, we've got to keep this mapping somewhere. So we created our own little, we tried to do the best we could to put it in a centralized place and give it a clean sort of REST experience. But ultimately, we're now playing a role in the routing here via the configuration of these intended environments. So after you get off and you come back from your user pool, we're actually going to use that URL to figure out where to send you. And this is another one where I feel like there's got to be a better way. It's one of those ones where it feels like, in general, I would say for multi-tenant environments, these entry points of applications, I wish they had more native sort of notions of multi-tenancy and tenant context here, where they would let us write rules on the fly to send you different places. But maybe those things will eventually come.
Yeah.
But if the other sort of dimension of this, and I sort of wandered off in a little bit of an area that's, I apologize as a tangent, but I thought was interesting here was the other thing in the reference architecture for serverless is you'll see that we've done like usage plans here. So for me, it's sort of in the routing sort of discussion, only in that depending on the type of tier you are, your request is going to get context attached to it, which is going to determine throttling policies and all those other good things. So this notion of throttling, which is a whole nother show we would have, still gets sort of mixed into this routing sort of discussion, because part of my knowing my routing is part of knowing which policy I'm going to apply to you to deal with the throttling story here. And in actuality, they came up with a pretty clever solution. The folks that worked on that, Anubhav and Ujwal inside of our team that worked on that, They, instead of just using an API key, because usage plans, if you're not familiar with them at AWS, that manage API gateway sort of policies here around throttling, they're tied to an API key. But instead of having the client app have us know the API key, they used one API key for all the requests. But then during the processing of the request, they used an authorizer to essentially resolve the tenant context to a specific API key, and then made the API key the source of the API gateway, the source of the request. And by making it the source of the request, it could apply the policy. So essentially, from the outside in, everybody's just calling one API, but inside there, we are essentially figuring out which tenant you are, which API key you should use, and then saying, now process the rest of the request in the context of this particular API key, and now throttling will get applied. And I thought that was super clever.
Yeah, that is cool.
Maybe everybody's doing that, but I most of what I see people doing is pushing API keys out to the client side and saying, hey, we'll issue you an API key, and then the app that's running on that side will use the API key. Well, now I've got API keys per tenant, per tier, and the scale of all of that and the manageability of all that becomes a bit of a problem.
We got a guy that did something
there. Go for it.
No question. But we got a guy internally that had done something similar on the EKS workshop, I think, as part of some stuff he was developing. Put usage plans put API gateway in front of EKS to do just that, to do the usage plans, so that you could offload basic tiers to some subordinate level, and not blow your system up based on free tier usage or something.
I honestly didn't know this was possible until I saw what the serverless team had done with it. So I thought this was a super clever kind of workaround. We won't dig into the code a ton, but to me, the secret sauce thing here is this idea that when we're making and configuring the API gateway, that we can set the authorizer as the source. And by setting the authorizer as the source, now we treat the rest of the request as the configuration of that API key and all the other bits that we set up. So to me, that was the sort of hidden gem in all of this that made all of that possible. Okay, so we've looked across, like, obviously VP, like siloed, full stack siloed. Look at all the kind of nuances there. We looked at EKS, we looked at serverless. We looked at the different deployment models. Like, what are some big takeaways here we can offer up, Toby? And maybe they're going to be vague and hand wavy, and that's okay. Yeah. But obviously, I think there's some themes that are here, right? Like, clearly, like, the nature of your stack is, and the technology you're using and the nature of your deployment model are going to have a pretty big impact.
Yeah, I would say that although identity is a separate topic, it is kind of a close cousin to routing, right? Like they are intrinsically kind of tied a lot of times because they depend on one another. So that was something we discovered as we were doing, some of the reference stuff.
Right, but I'm just saying, like, if I'm EKS, or if I'm serverless, if I'm siloed, if I'm pooled, if I'm siloed and pooled, if I have crazy tiering, like, all of those things, the mix of those things that are unique to some one application are going to probably have impose some specific rules on your routing strategy. Like,
100%. I was saying
it's not going to be a one size fits all kind of approach.
No, for sure. Yeah. There's obviously, of all the things that we talk about that are SaaS oriented, I think this has the most nuance. I think that there's also the state of the art is also constantly changing here. So just like this Istio stuff, right? There's like that is a truism for sure. When you're asking for takeaways, that was one of the takeaways that I had, was that identity and routing are pretty combined, right? Like, it's hard to separate the two.
Yeah, I mean, I think of this in 3 domains. Maybe it's not right, but I think of, like, the front door, like, just what are you going to do to get in the front door? That's part of the routing strategy. That's the obvious one. Then there's how does the front door get you authenticated? And then how does that authentication get routed to the right backend service and share that authentication context as part of that, right?
Totally.
Those are the 3 buckets. But then you can see across the spectrum of the environments, and that was at least the goal today, effective or not, of saying you can see across these different environments. Like we would probably have to ask you like 15 questions to be able to say where should you really land, which technology land on, and to me, in some stacks, the options are and the list of options are a lot more extensive. Like to me, if you're in the containers universe, like you could probably go out to Stack Overflow and ask this question, and you might get 15 different answers depending on what you do here. I think the mesh is certainly a trend there, but there's a lot of options here.
Scale is a dimension, I think, that well, scale, I think, affects every aspect of your architecture for sure, and it's something you want to plan for, making sure that all of the bits where you're pushing up against limits would be, you'd have appropriate story for, but particularly in routing, right? Like there's just certain things that would be off the table if your scale were sufficiently high.
Yeah, especially around anything that is a full stack silo, right? If you're a full stack silo, that's the first place limits there. But the truth is, like we talked about the ALB kind of routing limits there, you have to think about where those limits are. Even at API gateway, you're going to think about where do I have limits and what am I doing with those limits, and so on. So absolutely scale and maybe latency as well can be in this, right?
Yeah, because if you have like you said, if you have to resolve, if you don't have any caching in place and you got to reach out and go resolve tenant context for every single request that's coming in, that could be a bottleneck if you don't have appropriate caching or speed compute, behind that. Cool.
And I guess maybe one that overlays this a little bit is, how does it affect the friction of my onboarding experience? Like how does if I'm going to have to automate all this stuff, because it's like, great, I picked all these tools, but somewhere in my onboarding, that has to be a fully automated configuration of that, right? How do I set up service mesh? How do I automate the configuration of all these things? And how do I do that in a repeatable way?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. And that's the, I think just to kind of take that rabbit hole for a second, when we were setting out to do any of these reference architectures, not to beat that dead horse, I feel like I said that like a dozen times, but when we set out to write these things, it wasn't so much that we felt like we were, breaking new ground or providing, something that nobody had ever seen before. It's not like there was a whole bunch of secret sauce in there. What it really was just a good end-to-end implementation, right? We've got all of this advice kind of in pockets, but we never had one kind of end-to-end implementation that cherry picked some of that advice and put it all together into one solution.
Yeah, and the more we put it together, it brings out these new ideas that people will see the reference architecture and say, well, when I try service mesh, why not bolt qubit cost onto it, right? Like all that stuff. So I think that's all good because it stimulates all that discussion. So anyway, I know we're running up against time here. Again, I hope this was useful to people. It was a bit of an experiment in terms of going wide instead of deep. But hopefully there's some gems in here that are useful to you, and certainly appreciate you joining the show here, and look forward to having you a part of our next episode. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.